Eleanor's Zamzam Adventure. Eleanor is my grandmother. Eleanor's parents were missionaries. Missionaries are people who work for a church and travel to other countries to teach about God. Eleanor's mother and father worked in Tanzania, Africa, until the war. After the war, Eleanor's dad stayed in Africa, and Eleanor's mom and the children lived in Kansas. Eleanor liked Africa when she was little. She lived in a concrete house with no electricity. She did, however, have flowing water in her house because her house was near a stream and ran a pipe to the stream. Eleanor had 5 brothers and sisters. She was the eldest girl, and she had to work the hardest of the 3 girls. She made bread, cooked, pulled weeds, and washed dishes. Her brother liked to tease her by throwing dishes in the air. Sometimes he didn't catch the dishes and they broke on the floor. For fun, she played school. She played the violin and the saxophone. Her dad was gone in Africa most of the time she was growing up. Eleanor lives in Kansas, the very same town she grew up. In April 1941, Eleanor was almost 9 years old. She was on a passenger ship called the Zamzam when one of the worst events in her life happened. The Zamzam was shelled. It was shelled by a famous German warship, the Atlantis. The Zamzam started to sink, and that was only the beginning. The only reason the Germans did this was because they thought it was a cargo ship. When they realized their mistake, they tried to help the Zamzam passengers. All of Eleanor's family, except for her father, who was already in Africa, got into a lifeboat, but that foundered. If they hadn't had their life jackets on, they would have drowned. Her family floated in the ocean for 3/4 of an hour. 2 smaller German ships from the Atlantis had come to rescue the Zamzam passengers. Her family floated in the water until one of the smaller German ships reached them 45 minutes later. The ship took them to the Atlantis. Then they had to climb a 20-foot ladder to get on to the Atlantis. Each person had a German soldier behind them in case they fell. After the passengers were rescued and all the supplies were off the Zamzam, they blew up the Zamzam and sank it. The Germans sank it so the British warships wouldn't get suspicious. A warship is not the right kind of ship for citizens that aren't soldiers, so the Zamzam survivors were transferred to a German freighter called the Dresden. Eleanor turned 11 on the Dresden. The Zamzam survivors were kept on the Dresden for 32 days. The Zamzam survivors called it the prison ship. The living conditions on the Dresden were terrible because there were no toys and very little food and water because the Dresden weren't prepared for extra people. The Zamzam survivors had to eat gruel. Eleanor called it wallpaper paste. Eleanor remembers always being thirsty. The Zamzam survivors didn't know when they were going to be released, but then the freighter made a right turn. The Zamzam survivors knew the ship was headed to France and freedom. However, they had to go through a danger zone. This was a zone where British ships often looked for German ships to sink. The British had no way of knowing the Zamzam survivors were on the Dresden, so they would shoot the Dresden without hesitation. The people on the Dresden saw 2 British warships, but fortunately the ship passed through safely. The survivors were kept in France 2 weeks. After that, they were moved to Spain and then Portugal. U.S. citizens were sent home. The other nationalities were sent to prisoner of war camps for the remainder of the war, which was 4 years.